Thank you very much. Having been sampling the pleasures of international travel gone wrong for the last few days, I'm very, very glad to be here. Thank you, everybody. Apologies for forcing a bit of a rearrangement of talks. First thing I'd like to say is that I'll probably be trying to step back up to a slightly higher level view, be introducing some material that comes from a number of different people, organisations, not necessarily just TNC who I'm working with at the moment. So this talk has my name on it, Luis Solozano and Joe Pollock, who might be a familiar name to some here. He comes from JCU, but many, many others. And what I'd like to do really is just try and put some of the coral work that we've been doing in the context of the other marine habitats that we've been looking at. I've been involved in marine habitat restoration for 15 years now. Started seriously with Noah's Restoration Centre, actually the same group that Tali's working with, for 5 years in the US, and then jumped across to the Nature Conservancy. But you know, putting a starting date on restoration is, for me anyway, a fairly difficult thing. A lot of the work really began in the 80s on a number of different habitats. But for me, a definition of restoration does have a scale component to it. So, you know, starting with biology and experimenting with what's possible is not necessarily the start of restoration. In my definition, that's where you start actually thinking about reintroducing an area of habitat rather than experimentation. That tended to be in the early 2000s. Sorry, we're a bit delicate here. So the marine habitats that I've been working with, I tend to group as the critical coastal ecosystems or critical coastal habitats. And for me, they include the salt marsh, seagrass, the mangroves, and also the reef-forming organisms. And the reef formers are really the shellfish and the corals. And these are ecological equivalents. They both tend to form, you know, massive structures. These are massive calcium carbonate-based structures with a veneer of living organisms on the outside. They're the ecosystem engineers that create the habitat for us. The reason we tend not to think about shellfish in that light is that they were fairly mined out, at least by the mid-last century, in a lot of areas by the turn of the last century. So there's really no living memory of these habitats as being the massive reef structures that they should be. But they are ecological equivalents of corals. The shellfish tend to take over at the higher latitudes, the corals obviously in the more tropical latitudes, and in those estuarine areas. And we know about the rates of loss. The rates vary. The trajectory has been very much the same. Reefs at Risk we visited a number of years ago now put 75% threatened for coral reefs. Globally, that figure has been going up a little too rapidly recently. Seagrass around 30% loss, also going up. Recent losses in Shark Bay alone will have increased that number. Salt marsh mangroves about 50%, and the oyster reefs particularly that we've been able to measure, 85% loss, and that's very conservative. And the threats are similar for all of these different habitats. We've got the global threat, which is climate change, and a threat that really desperately needs to be addressed. There are sessions dedicated to that, so I won't be actually talking that much about the climate change in relation to corals. But that's the global threat. We have the local threats as well, and you can read through this list, and they are obviously relevant to all of the coral work. But this list of threats is just as relevant to those other critical coastal ecosystems as well. These have been the drivers for decline. Overfishing is essentially what's removed our shellfish habitats. the nutrients and sediments, the water quality is just as relevant to seagrasses as it is to coral reefs. So these are threats that are uniformly needing to be addressed to actually improve the condition of our coasts. So climate change, we've got a lot of focus on coming up. And I know I'm speaking to the converted, preaching to the converted here. Dave mentioned this morning. So I got here just for the last couple of sentences of your presentation, Dave, wherever you are. Apologies for missing that. But was pleased to hear that addressing these local threats is very much at the top of mind. Really to be in the position to look at restoration at all. We need to have either addressed the causes of that decline, figured out how to avoid those causes of decline, or figured out how to reintroduce our ecosystem engineers that are somehow adapted to a changed environment. And if we can't get to that point, then restoration really isn't going to work. So there is a very critical component of any ecosystem restoration planning that has to do with threats. And the other point here is that the more the climate change, the global threats are impacting the ecosystems that we're concerned with, the more critical it is to reduce the local threats that we can actually do something about to improve the resilience of those ecosystems in the face of the big hairy monsters of global climate change. The other point that I'd like to make here is one about community. Restoration itself as an activity is a fantastic way of involving community in something that they know is important. It's been my experience around the world that the population at large knows full well that there are problems. They're just not sure what to do about it. And including, or actually engineering a way of including the community into restoration is a really powerful tool. And that tool becomes important for developing that grassroots political will to actually do the important work to fund things like addressing threats. Water quality is one that we all know about here in the Great Barrier Reef. It's not easy. It does require political will, and the more community support you have for that, the better off we are. So it's an important component, I think, of any of the restoration work that gets done. This is just a couple of shots. The top one there is one morning fairly early in Alabama. 600 people turned up to help us schlep various components of an oyster reef restoration project out across the mud. Bottom right are volunteers employed in collecting seed pods from eelgrass, the zostra, in Virginia. Bottom left is volunteers, community members working at some scallop seed to get that ready to actually reintroduce into restored eelgrass meadows to complete that part of the ecosystem. And if we're talking community and developing that community support that is important to restoration, it's also been fairly relevant to tackle directly the question, why should anybody bother? And obviously the answer is the ecosystem services. But it's important to put those ecosystem services into the same kind of context that's being talked about. So the services that, if we're in Cairns talking coral reefs, tourism is one that's got to be at the top of the list. Coastal protection, Tali was mentioning this morning, very high value service from some of these habitats. Fish production, I don't think I have time to open up fish production, but that's also really important. Jobs. There are a lot of jobs associated with the process of restoration itself. Blue carbon. These are a suite of services that we need to unpack. And the reason for unpacking them, I think, is to put dollar values next to each of these services, to be able to talk in the same language as business, to be able to articulate the value in terms of GDP, real national gross domestic product from some of these services. That's the only way we're really going to get the level of funding required to scale up in the sense that we've been talking about even in the sessions I heard this morning. So I'll unpack a couple of those just briefly, give you a high-level tour of some of the work that we've been involved in. Tourism is one that is obviously at the top of the list. And how do you put dollar values against some of the tourism values of our reefs? That requires getting hold of the data, so we've got national and local data sets that come from industry. These are numbers and expenditures, arrivals of tourists and expenditures per tourist. There's a geospatial component to that. So we've actually been able to divide this down in a fairly spatially accurate way. In fact, it's interesting, a bit scary and interesting. Our social media platforms, the Twitters, the Snapchats, the Instagrams are in fact public databases. And a lot of photos, most photos these days actually have a GPS point associated with them. It's not difficult, given the different spectra of underwater photographs, to automatically scan these social media databases and pull out underwater photographs, and you get a location. So there's a very powerful way just there of separating out the tourism associated with the reef intimately, as opposed to those people who are interested in the beach or what we call reef adjacent tourism. So we've been able to separate out the direct fishing and underwater activities of tourism from the reef adjacent tourism and map out some of the numbers. One of the important things about some of these ecosystem services is recognising that, unlike a habitat map where there is habitat or there is not, the level of service varies markedly depending on where you are. This is just a shot of the reefs of Florida. This is total tourism value. The darker the red, the higher the value. The dark red there is over $3 million per square kilometre. Annual value of reef. Anything in the red spectrum is over $1 million per square kilometre of reef, and that's total value. Here we're going down to the reef-specific values, and these are all available online. This is publicly accessible data. That oceanwealth.org URL at the bottom there. Go to oceanwealth.org and click on the mapping portal button. You go straight into this series of options that you see down the left of that screen. The tourism values are one of them. But it's interesting to me, we can actually map out the reef-related. The next one there is the adjacent tourism. And in Florida, there's a lot more beach activity going back up again to the reef than there is reef-related. That's different depending on where you are. The numbers are also pretty impressive. Florida, just by itself, 3 million trips. You've got $3 billion in reef tourism, $8.5 billion in, 100 million in reef adjacent tourism. So that's all the way to there, 1.15 billion total for Florida on an annual basis. And again, there's a spatial component to this. We can actually see where the most important reefs are, the most valuable reefs are, depending on the service that you're looking at. Globally, the number's obviously much bigger, 70 million trips per year, 19 billion on-reef tourism and 16 billion reef-adjacent tourism on a global level. And that's actually some of the difference between the reef associated and the adjacent to reef tourism. The global value of the reef-related tourism is higher. 71 countries with reefs that are worth more than $1 million a year per square kilometre. So that kind of work is relevant to talking GDP and getting ourselves in the same kind of business language that governments tend to respond to. It was also the winner of a tourism award last year. It also makes the point, which I think is worth making here, that You know, healthy reefs are good for tourism, but tourism can actually be good for healthy reefs. We know that some of the threats towards our reefs are coming from that coastal development, overbuilding, the land reclamation, that kind of thing. But the focus from the tourist operations back onto the reef is also of value. So it's a pretty high level, but I'll just open up some of the coastal protection work that's going on as well, and this was mentioned by Tali earlier. Really in concept, the coastal protection work is very simple. The habitats that occur between the open ocean wave environment and the high water mark are what interact with waves to control wave energy. And you've got the two different functions. A reef, you can look at this as a coral reef or a shellfish reef, is really a submerged breakwater. It's causing waves to crest, break and distribute their energy. Similarly with mangroves onshore, we should probably have seagrass in between here as well. The second function that's actually worth keeping in mind is friction, the friction coefficient, the rugosity of that reef. And in an engineering sense, that's actually more important than I find intuitive. But my high school physics is still relevant. I think it's 7 times the wavelength is the depth that a wave touches the bottom. And depending on the rugosity of the bottom, the friction coefficient changes a lot. And the amount of energy that gets drawn out of a wave from the bottom as it tries to pass across is really significant. So even in areas like this, a bare sand or mud bottom provides very little friction. Any of our structured habitats, which is what all of those critical coastal ecosystems are, draw the energy out of the wave quite quickly. And we can look at that, we can use that information and actually model what happens with wave energy as it approaches the shore. We have good information on offshore wave data, we have bathymetry, we have habitat maps, and we can actually calculate in a modelling sense what that's going to do to wave energy as it approaches the shore. And we've done this on a global basis. The global assessment was looking at a maximum transect distance of every 2 kilometres. Most of it was closer than that, 1 kilometre. And we've been able to do that at much finer scales for areas that we thought were more important. And where this is going is if we have, and generally we can get hold of something like 60 years of offshore wave history data. So we have good information on the wave energies of different wave states, different storm intensities. We can model the interaction of the habitats with that wave energy and estimate flood levels for different storm events, a 10-year storm, a 25-year storm, a 100-year storm, choose your poison. We can do that, importantly, both with habitat and without habitat. The dashed line here representing the flood level for a 10-year storm without habitat, the solid line representing the extent of the storm surge, the flood level with habitat, and the value of the infrastructure in between is the value of the infrastructure protected by that offshore habitat. It becomes relevant. You know, we've globally got some pretty big numbers to deal with. These are billions, and we're up around 200 billion annually damages even with habitat from our increasing storm intensity. This is the one metre value that Tyler mentioned this morning. Remove 1 metre of reef height, and that nearly doubles. We've got another 200 billion annually to deal with. Something that hasn't escaped the World Bank, that's gone into all of their recommendations, and it's also something on the oceanwealth.org website where these are available if you'd like to noodle around with those and see what is accessible on that interface. So it becomes particularly relevant that's relevant for talking to government on a national scale. Conceptually, the importance of habitat in the national accounting systems. But this is an example of the Yucatan Peninsula, that bit of Mexico that sticks out into the Caribbean. And that's the Cancun area, part of the huge tourism infrastructure of Mexico. And here we've gone in and actually looked at what the protection for this strip of hotel tourism infrastructure and the relationship between the offshore reef. So we map that out. We find that on this Cancun strip of the Yucatan Peninsula, you have a number of reefs that are multiple millions of dollars per square kilometre. And we have been through the exercise of looking at what the increase in cost of a storm would be for various different levels of damage to that offshore reef. And from that, working with Swiss Re, one of the 6 big reinsurance companies globally, have come up with an insurance package to insure that Mesoamerican reef. So talking about, I think there's a talk later on in the program about innovative financing mechanisms. This is a fairly innovative finance. This gives us the opportunity here, so I'll open it up a bit. This is a parametric insurance product. So it doesn't involve risk damage assessment. If we have a house damage, somebody comes out and says how much you can get back for that damage and your repair stuff. With a parametric insurance, it is activated by a trigger. So in this case, once wind speed gets to a predetermined level, there is a payout. There is no assessment. And what that means is that as soon as that wind speed has been reached, you've got money in hand to, as soon as the waves die down and you can find a boat that hasn't been destroyed, get teams out there to do the immediate work, to get the old growth corals back on their feet, to try and increase or save as much of that old growth and rugosity as possible. And then you can start immediately on the re-levelling, restructuring work if that needs to be done. You don't have that lag. So in situations like last fall where there were 3 hurricanes through the Caribbean, one after the other, you can actually get out in between and be working on reinstalling that protection value of the reef. A test case, another one that Tali mentioned briefly this morning, I'll open up a little bit, is the work we're doing in Grenada. So here we have the Eastern Caribbean, Florida up the top, Grenada way down the bottom. In fact, the Venezuelan peninsula is just down here. Grenville has absolutely nothing to do with tourism. It is just a supply and fishing town. It's the second biggest town in Grenada. And up in the north of Grenville Bay is where we'll be focused. So it's this barrier reef, this offshore barrier reef system here that's basically been killed off. That has down to less than 2% coral cover on that reef. It's eroding down. It's now about a metre deeper than it was 40, 50 years ago. And there's a commensurate amount of wave energy getting into this bay that historically hasn't. The erosion of this shoreline has responded as you'd expect. So there's been an enormous amount of erosion there. This is an example on shore. This structure out here is actually the remains of a drain that used to take water out to the coast out here about 100 metres out. So there is infrastructure falling into the ocean there. And the options are, put in a bulkhead, add riprap, or think about restructuring that reef to actually recreate the shoreline protection function that's been lost. And that's what we're trying. It's a mixed model, so it's a grey-green infrastructure. It's not just coral reef restoration. We actually can't restore a reef to expect that kind of growth in the time frame that's required. So what we're doing is restructuring that reef, actually putting in large gabions essentially to raise the level of the reef, recreate that shoreline protection function, and do that in a way that facilitates the replanting of coral afterwards. There's been a lot of modelling work put into figuring out just what that intervention should look like in terms of elevation that we're looking for, the amount of height, the length, the position on the reef. And then we have also been very focused on making sure that as part of the social resilience of what is a fairly poor community, the money that is involved in this project stays in that community. So all of the materials are sourced locally, all of the welding, all of the fabrication is done locally, and the local divers that are doing it, including a couple of fairly wild South Africans who are the commercial divers. I think you need to be a commercial diver to drive that thing. It's actually a fantastic, this is built of weld mesh and empty rum barrels. Very, very cheap, very Caribbean. But waves actually do flow through it rather than breaking over it. It's a very stable platform for working in a fairly ugly environment. So it's worked beautifully. Well, we've used that to ferry materials out to the reef, stacking the divers out, building up the reef, re-levelling that reef to recreate the wave breaking function. And we've been experimenting with the translocation of corals and figuring out how we might do that to get that reef growing in a way that will keep up with future sea level rise. So that's the idea of the Grenada project. At the moment, we have installed just 4 very small patches. We've got about 30 metres of pilot structure out on the reef to test that the design is going to do what we hope it's going to do. We've been monitoring for 3 years. It looks like that's actually working pretty well. We've made some modifications, and we are at the position now where we hope to be putting in 300 metres rather than 30 to influence the wave environment. Down here in the bottom right, the brighter colours, the higher wave energy. These are modelling results. We had 300 metres of reef. It's a metre shallower than it is currently, and recreate that protected environment behind. Before I leave the ecosystem service kind of view of some of the work being done, I'd just like to pop this up for anybody that hasn't seen. This is a reasonable description of the job creation capacity of habitat restoration. These numbers come from the Stimulus Act, actually, the Obama-era stimulus after the economic downturn of '98. There was a stimulus package to get the US population back to work, and a coalition of the conservation organisations in the US at the time managed to secure a small amount of that funding for habitat restoration. A small amount of that funding was actually a huge amount for habitat. It was over 150 million. And it was focused on job creation, so there was quite a focus on collecting the data to actually support this view of the jobs created through habitat restoration. There's been some more recent work done in Australia that has actually supported this. I'll be presenting some of that this afternoon at a shellfish talk. And as a last thought before I run out of time, I wanted to come back to a topic that's already been mentioned a couple of times, which is the networking and the partnerships. You know, it's like involving the community in restoration to actually deliberately build up that social capital and the political will that's required to carry out some of this restoration work. It's bigger than any one of our organisations, and I'm quite convinced of that. It does require a collaborative approach, and it does require some fairly good communication. I was very pleased, Charlie, thank you very much for stressing that this morning. this reef resilience platform, I'll call it. It's not a TNC branded thing. It actually started as a collaboration between Acropora and TNC. NOAA has taken over as being heavily involved for a long time. It supports the CRC work, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say that the RAP project is interested in using this as well as a platform for connecting the group that is scattered around the world at this point. And just a screenshot to leave you with, this is all available online. This one is the science section here that contains the restoration work. Another one that's actually good to have a look at are the case studies. One of the things that's really important with restoration is knowing what doesn't work as well as what has worked. That's stuff that doesn't usually get into the published literature, but these case studies are a great way of actually going through the logic that is good to set up some of the projects and document what has and hasn't worked. So there's another one to keep in mind. And with that, I think I'll time.